this computer. There we go. How y'all doing?
Good.
Good? Yeah, you survived the big snowfall?
We did. We did.
Or you still are, maybe? I don't know which.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I heard it was real bad up your way. So
Yeah.
I was driving back from Georgia, from Savannah, actually, through that storm, all the way up through that storm, actually,
Oh,
up
wow.
I-75. So that was a fun time. Fun time. I'll go ahead and get started, I guess. We only have 45 minutes, right? So, okay. And I lost my, give me a second here. Let me share my screen. Since I forgot to do that, share a screen.
Perfect.
And good. You should see it full screen now.
Yep.
Ah, great, great. Sometimes it works easily. So, hey, thanks everybody for coming. I do like presentations that are interactive with questions and suggestions. We don't have a lot of time today, but just feel free to speak up and let me know if you have any questions. I made this slide kind of as a metaphor for the process of long exposure photography. As you'll see, there's a long exposure can take a lot of different forms, a lot of different methods to take long exposure. But first of all, we won't advance. We'll try this again. There we go. So first of all, who's this guy talking, right? I'm a retired automotive engineer and live in the Detroit suburbs. I'm somebody who enjoys all genres of photography. I'm somebody that enjoys teaching, and I'm somebody who enjoys travel. So I'll put all those things together, and my retirement job is to do photo workshops. So I took over last year for Brian F. Peterson, if you know who that is, doing some of his workshops in the spring as well as the fall, and then started my own workshop business at the late end of 2025. So if you have any questions, you can contact me with the website below or the email. Feel free to snap a shot of this if you want to get those. It'll be later on in the presentation too. So with that, we'll move on. So here's the topics I'm going to discuss tonight. First, into the what and why of long exposure. A lot of discussion about images, but after the fun part, then we get into the how of creating long exposure images. The planning, the guidelines, the equipment, and all that boring stuff. So, and I'll get a copy of these handouts to Christy after the presentation too, so you can have those as reference later on. So what is long exposure? It was really hard to define. I couldn't find anything on the web that really hit the nail on the head for me. I think we all can all agree that we know it when we see it, but it took me a while to really define it. So what do you guys think? You have any definition of long exposure? It's probably going to be hard to be interactive, but.
When I was scrolling through the link that you had initially sent me, I was very excited to see both daylight and nighttime nighttime photos in there, because
Yeah.
I think when I personally think of long exposure, I'm thinking, oh yeah, like I'm at night, I'm really trying to get those
Yep.
super low light conditions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody has a little bit different experience, right, with the things that they've seen, the things that they've done. So what really struck a chord with me was just asking what a short exposure is. To me, a short exposure is something that freezes motion. And a long exposure is the opposite of that, something that smooths out motion. So to get a real, in my opinion, get a long exposure image, you have to be smoothing out motion and smoothing out the movement of something in the image. So a long exposure is slice of time where the image captures the blur of motion. The length of time depends on what's moving, how fast, how close you are, what lens you're using. Long could be hundredths of a second, or it could be several minutes. And in the following slides, you'll see what I mean. And as a side, all my pictures will have the settings in there. If you have any questions about settings, they'll be right in the image as well. But if you have any other questions, please ask. And now that we've defined long exposure, let's get to some examples. As with the previous photo, the movement of the clouds is a very standard subject for long exposure. The right clouds can add a texture with a dramatic flare from their flow and contrast. Because they provide texture, they make excellent candidates for black and white images, such as this one. The flow of clouds can be a compositional element, again, as in this image, where the cloud movement moves diagonally in a counterpoint to the arch, the St. Louis arch, moving the other direction. So it adds texture, it adds drama, it adds a leading line leading through the image. And just to give you an idea of what those clouds look like, here's a much shorter exposure, right? So just broken clouds, basically. So what makes good long exposure clouds? There has to be contrasting areas of bright and dark of the clouds and the sky, as you see in this picture, right? A flat, even gray sky will not produce streaks. You need some color or brightness contrast in the sky. And the clouds have to be moving. There has to be movement. It can be very fast, it can be slow, and the wind speed will determine what your shutter time is. So, as I said in the previous slide, it's a lot of different factors to think about. Here's another long exposure with clouds of an old jackrabbit bean sign that's up in Saginaw, Michigan, or was actually. The clouds flow in the same direction that the rabbit is leaping, which I think complements the story, so it kind of just flows in that direction. And as you can see, this was shot at f/27. I was too lazy to put my ND filter on it. And for those of you wondering what f/27 looks like on your sensor, here it is. It's a bunch of spots, right? Here's the Lightroom dust removal aid called Visualize Spots. So at f/27, the depth of field is so large, it makes every speck of dust on your sensor show up. Years ago when I took this, it took a long time to clean up this image. And today there's a button for dust removal in Lightroom. But I wanted to point out that I think f/27 was a really bad idea on this one. I should have put on the neutral density filter and used a wider f-stop so that it didn't pick up every speck of dust on the sensor. So. In both of these images, the flowing clouds add drama. On the left, the clouds are moving directly toward the camera, kind of mimicking the shape of this lighthouse in downtown Detroit. They radiate from the center, kind of making the image more dynamic. And on the right, the clouds flow over the wings of the Milwaukee Art Museum. I don't know if you've ever been there. And notice how the diagonal direction of the cloud movement makes the image much more dramatic, right? Something that was straight on is not as dramatic. Something moving right and left would not have been as dramatic either, right? Wouldn't have the same impact in these images. Next, we'll talk about long exposure of waves and large bodies of water. This is a 30-second shot of flattening the water, the Detroit skyline in the background. And it made a really glassy reflection. The wind was very calm, and the water was fairly calm, just a little bit of ripple on the water. Kind of flattened out the choppy waves. You can see how the points of light are spread in the reflections, showing that there was actually movement in the water. You see sort of an up and down movement in this picture as well, from just spreading out that light. And from the shorter exposure, you can see how choppy the water was just a few hours earlier, just before sunset. So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a magical night. It's rare to get something that glassy smooth on the water, especially in the evening, it seems like. Now on to waterfalls, subject that is probably most photographed in long exposure. In this waterfall shot on the left, the short exposure really, the water is frozen, while on the right, or in the middle actually, the longer exposure captures the flow of the water, giving it that smooth, milky appearance. But one downside to using a long exposure is that the movement of other things in the image besides your subject, such as these branches that are blown by the wind. So one trick is to actually combine these two images using the waterfall from the long exposure image and the vegetation from the short exposure. So here's the result of both of those put together. Just blended together in Photoshop, different layers, just blend them together. So you get nice clear leaves with nice flowing water. You don't have the distraction of that blur. This was up in the Finger Lakes area of Watkins Glen, New York.
Nice.
So let's talk about shutter times for waterfalls. So which time do you like, right? What time should you use? The answer is what do you want it depends on what you want the water to look like. My opinion, personal opinion, is after 1 second, the water just looks overly blurry. It looks like it's out of focus. I like to have texture in the water. So in this particular waterfall, I like the quarter to a half second probably range. Everyone's going to have their own taste on what they want, and what you like is your own personal style. So some people like it to be rather lengthy, some people like it in the middle, some people like it more toward the textured side of things. So it all depends. But to me, the more flow of the water, the shorter the exposure, in my opinion. This is about mid-range on water flow. But good to take a series of images. Don't just take one shot and say that's good enough. Take a series of images and see which one you like better later. This is Tognac Falls in the New York Finger Lakes. This waterfall drops over 215 feet. It's taller than Niagara Falls. It's a really huge amount of water falling over from Tognac Creek. And this crop is about half the height of the falls. And just to show the detail of the different shutter times. So which flow do you like better? There's no right answer. It's all about personal preference. Personally, on this one with a higher water flow, I like the shorter exposure. I like the 1/10 of a second to 1/6 of a second. But again, each one's a personal choice, personal preference. Again, take as many pictures as you can. Take the variable amount of exposure just so you can see which one you like better later. So to me, with waterfalls with really low flow rates, like this one down in West Virginia, seem to be better for longer shutter times. I think the wispy texture in the water really adds to the image, and the flow here kind of leads down level to level with more cascades to enjoy. So this one was about 3/4 of a second, about 0.7 seconds. So, but the wispier ones you can see through them anyway, so the texture looks really good through that wispiness.
Nice.
Another aspect of water is capturing the flow in a stream. You can capture the flow of the bubbles, the leaves, etc., as they create interesting patterns in the stream. However, the flow of the stream is much slower than that, than the fall, compared to the fall of the water. So you need to combine images of a long exposure waterfall with a much longer exposure for the flow of the stream to get a really good image. So the flow of this stream was about 10 seconds. And I used the same for the waterfall, but I really should have used a shorter exposure for the waterfall, because you can see there's a real lack of texture in the waterfall. Okay. Now here's a shameless plug for using a circular polarizer to reduce reflections and glare when photographing water. Even though the sun isn't out, the blue cast and the glare on the stones and leaves is greatly reduced with a circular polarizer. So just in these two images, with and without the polarizer, look at the difference in glare in the stone and the leaves, and look at the glare difference, the blue texture in the water, and how much that is reduced by a polarizer. So taking pictures of waterfalls, vegetation, please use a polarizer. It's not just for darkening the sky. It can be used to eliminate that reflective glare off of a lot of different subjects. Moving on to vehicles. Vehicles really create a dynamic aspect to an image. You can see the motion of these bicycles. The selection of shutter time is critical to make sure whatever you're photographing is still recognizable. So that optimum shutter time depends on how fast the object is moving and how far away it is from the camera. Oops, sorry. And to some degree what lens you're using. Notice that this quote unquote long exposure is only 1/60th of a second, right here. 1/60th of a second to catch the blur of these riders as they're screaming around the velodrome. Yeah, it all depends on what you're moving, and how close you are. So in this image, you can see the riders exiting the frame on the right have much more blur than those that are behind. So the guys on the right side of the frame are really blurred, whereas the people coming around the corner are not blurred as much. And this is really due to the distance they are away from the camera. So things that are close to the camera will blur more, things that are further away will blur less. And just as a comparison, here's two different bikes crossing the frame. The one guy was up at the top of the velodrome ramp, if you will, whereas the other guy's down at the bottom. You see the guy that's closest to me is almost unrecognizable. The one down closer to the blue area is much more distinguishable as a rider. So, and they're both taken with the same 1/60th of a second, the same frame. So proximity really makes a big difference. Long exposures, yeah. Propeller-driven airplanes, the best shots have just the slightest amount of blur in the propeller, which is a challenge because they're already a moving object and you're trying to get the propeller to blur at the same time. It's a little like taking a panning shot to capture a moving plane. Getting the prop blur takes a little bit of trial and error and getting the correct shutter time. This particular quote unquote long exposure, doing air quotes, right, is 1/250th of a second. If you freeze the motion of the propellers, it just looks static. It looks like it's just frozen in the air, and that propeller blur really helps with airplane images, propeller plane images, obviously. So here's another vehicle. Motion of the Paramarcat 1225 locomotive, steam locomotive, as it pulls away from the town, Christmas town, returning back home. Couple things to note. Notice the difference in the amount of blur in the foreground, the headlight, this area on the right side versus the cab on the left side. Again, things that are close to you will blur differently than things that are further away. This is about probably a 90-foot difference here, about the length of the locomotive cab. And also the headlight and numbers blur smoothly. But other things reflected in kind of a dotted pattern. The reason for that dotted pattern is the street lights in that town were sodium vapor lights. So they're powered by alternating current, which basically flickers the lights at a high frequency, right? 120, 240 cycles per second. The blinking is much too fast for your eye to see, but the camera picks it up. So the locomotive headlamp was illuminated by an incandescent light, which is constant, right? It doesn't have that flickering, doesn't have that alternating current flickering. So one thing to be thinking about is the type of lighting that's being used to illuminate the scene. Most things will not have the flicker, but some things will have that flicker, including things like neon, right? If you do motion blur with any neon lights, you'll get that staccato look to the lights where they have that on and off, because they're really turning on and off at a very high frequency. Here's another long exposure of the locomotive that's capturing the blur of the steam. Long exposure was necessary because of, well, number one, the low light level, and number two, because I wanted it to be as long as possible to capture that blur, that movement of the steam, to show where the steam is coming from in the locomotive, not just the stack, but all the appliances, the electric generator and the pumps and the whatever on the locomotive. So long exposure is really nice. This is a 20-second exposure, but at f/16, but a very low ISO. Just trying to reduce the overall amount of light. So here's another subject, blurring of people. In this image, the two firemen are fairly stationary, but the shovel is moving and his arms are moving. So I captured the blur, the movement of that, shoveling the coal into the locomotive itself. So not the bodies themselves, but just the parts, the body parts, if you will. Now here's a longer exposure of a person, 1/10 of a second, but he was walking along at a pretty good clip. The blur is that he's still recognizable as a person, but not recognizable as who he is or what he's wearing exactly. You can still tell it's a person walking through the frame. And this is a good way to add the human element, but still provide some anonymity. So it adds that human person to the image, but you don't get caught up in the face and the clothing and what the person's doing or wearing. It just adds that human element that shows that this is the city. This was taken in Chicago. Here's another very long exposure of the Cloud Gate sculpture, also known as the Bean in Chicago. I made this long exposure mostly to get rid of the people on the ground, the reflection. So if you do a long enough exposure and the people continue moving, they'll actually blur themselves out of existence in the image. This is a 30-second exposure, so as long as the people on the ground were moving fairly quickly, they could get themselves out of there. You can see a little bit of ghosting here of a couple people here in the image. They didn't move quite fast enough for me, but because I was stationary, I tried to hide off in the distance. So this is me at the very edge, reflected in the beam, because I was over by the tripod, of course, watching the camera take the shot. So if you do a long enough exposure with moving things, it will actually blur them out of existence, blur them out of the image. So this is more of a night shot. It's not about blurring of movement, but just about gathering light for this long exposure. It's a 2.5 second exposure, enough light to see the core of the Milky Way over the entrance of the Goblin Valley State Park in Utah. You can see this is a pretty high ISO because I used an 88mm lens, a pretty long lens, and a short exposure. Well, short for astrophotography terms anyway. So 2.5 second exposure, ISO 32,000. People say, how do you use ISO 32,000? I talk about that in an astro presentation, but with high ISO pictures like this, you can blend them together, multiple pictures, and it will help eliminate the any noise that's in the image. So this was one of the first times I'd done this with the longer exposure, longer telephoto lens. So.
And did you say that was taken at Goblin Valley?
Goblin Valley, yeah, right at the very entrance to it.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, thanks. So this image is a hybrid of light gathering and sort of blurring of the steam. This is a 6 second exposure, so I allowed the steam to really blow away from the locomotive in the distance. But the guy in the foreground with the lantern had to really hold still as long as possible for that 6 seconds. And if you look real close at this image, you'll see a little bit of blur from where he moved in the lantern itself. There's just a slight blur in the lantern. So this again would probably be a good choice to blend two images together, one a short exposure for the person and a long exposure for the locomotive. So another hybrid image of long exposure and light gathering. I was taking a long exposure to capture the Capitol building in Charleston, West Virginia, over the Kanawha River. Long exposure was a good choice because it gathers a lot of light and allowed the river water to flow by and flatten, kind of improving the reflection. It's not glass smooth like we saw on the Detroit skyline because it's a flowing river, but still a pretty good reflection of the lighting there. So, but as a bonus, there was a lightning storm passing just south of town. So we were able to capture both at the same time. I just set my shutter to capture the Capitol building, and I just made a series of 30-second exposures. And during that series of exposures, I was able to capture the lightning in a couple of frames, with this being my favorite shot. So you'll see a difference on the right and left side. You'll see a difference in the texture of the water and the bushes. The bushes on the right are kind of frozen in place. The water, you can see every ripple on the surface of the water, right? So that's how wavy the water was as it was coming down. But on the left side, it's all blurred. It's all movement. And that has to do with the lighting. The lighting on the left all comes from the Capitol building and the ground lights. So that was just a minimum amount of light and just let the water flow by. The light on the left was from the bright flash of the lightning, right? The duration of lightning is about 1/5 of a second, which is basically a giant flash bulb, if you will, which kind of freezes the motion of the water in the windblown bushes. The bushes and the water on the left are illuminated by the light from the Capitol building. So kind of a interesting difference there in how those two are lit, just like the locomotive with the sodium vapor lights, right? They just each lighting each source of light is providing different amounts of light as well as different lengths of time of light. So kind of interesting. But it's a good technique if you ever want to capture lightning, is to do a long exposure and just do a series of them. If you know how to use the intervalometer in your camera or have an external one, you can just set the intervalometer up and take 30-second exposures over and over again, or 15 or 5 or whatever seconds you want. And then in some images, you'll capture lightning. So it's kind of a nice little trick to catch lightning, hopefully safely. So another type of long exposure is what's called light painting. And to me, there's two different types of light painting. One type paints the subject with light. So the light is directed away from the camera and toward the subject. The second, the light is pointed toward the lens and the light itself is the subject. So this one wasn't intended to capture motion, but I did capture an airplane streaking through it. Also, the shutter time, it was a 15-second image to capture the Milky Way. And the shutter time, I used the shutter time to light paint over this stump over on the Silver Lake Sand Dunes on Lake Michigan. I used a gel-covered light to just light paint that. So I set the delay timer on my camera for a 15-second exposure with a 5-second delay, walked around to the left of the stump, light painted it for 15-20 seconds, and then went back to the camera to see how I did. So it doesn't really fit the motion blur definition of long exposure, but it shows the options that are available during a long exposure. This is that other kind of light painting, where the light is directed toward the camera and becomes the subject itself. This is burning still wool and spinning it in a circle. This is a 30-second exposure. The person spun the steel wool, and I was able to move them out of the way with some post-processing. So a bit of a difference there in how you're lighting toward the camera versus away from the camera toward the subject. So, and it becomes a decorative element. The light itself becomes a decorative element. And here there are both types of light painting combined to create interesting patterns. So this is a light changing LED wand. In one pass, it was used to illuminate the bridge and the arches. So reflected light off the subject, if you will, which is the arches. And then a second pass with the light pointed toward the camera, which created this sort of raked changing light color as it went through the image. So both types of light painting in one image for this one. Kind of a wild thing. It's kind of a fun night to play with that light wand. Might have to do that again sometime. And then fireworks are also a form of light trails. Here you're capturing the motion of light that is directed at the lens. The light itself is the subject, but kind of like the lightning shot, the shutter was open for longer than the fireworks were lit. So this was an 8-second exposure, of which probably the lightning was only 2 to 3 seconds of it, but the aperture was opened, the shutter was opened, excuse me, before the fireworks went up. Then as it exploded and expanded, captured that light that came from the fireworks. So similar to the lightning shot, right? Just do a longer exposure. The other way to do lightning or firework shots is to just cover the lens as well. On some of those long exposures, you can just cover the lens with a card or your hand even, just to block the light until you want it to start to expose. Kind of an old school way to take fireworks pictures. So another subject of light trails is cars on a highway. This is Pittsburgh. The flow of traffic can create really interesting leading lines. This was a 30-second image to allow as much traffic flow as we could get. Unfortunately, the center lanes weren't being used at that time because they're the HOV lanes, the expensive lanes. So, but still, the lights going into town are all red. Lights coming out of town on the left are all white because they're headlights. The real challenge in these is just balancing the light between the two, because the headlights are always much, much brighter than the red taillights, as you know when you drive, right? So you have to strike a balance between the two. Another form of light trails is light from the stars. This is up at Trillium Lake in Mount Hood in Oregon. This was 113 images at 30 seconds each, all combined together, which is just about an hour of light in total. So getting the spiraling of the stars, or actually the spinning of the Earth under the stars, technically. I was trying to get the reflection on the water. You can see the reflection's not pristine, not perfect, because the water was disturbed by wind every once in a while, so it sort of looks like an acoustic signal, up and down, up and down, up and down. But yeah, it kind of worked out pretty well. Not exactly what I wanted, but it was pretty cool. So this is looking northward toward the North Star. So here's another Star Trails photo, but this one's looking south. This is looking toward the South Polar Star, and it really creates a different look. This is a barn up in the dunes up in western Michigan on Lake Michigan, so Sleeping Bear Dunes. But it really creates a different look. It almost looks like they're horizontal or arched in two different ways. And also, I kind of underexposed this. I had a really low ISO, which underexposing with these star trails really does bring out a lot more color in the stars. So you get to see the blues and the yellows and the other colors that really come from the stars when you overexpose. And the previous one was probably a little bit overexposed and they all came out as white, but this gives more of a true color of the stars, intensity too. Here's another light trail. This one I just took a couple weeks ago down in Florida. Light trail of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket taken from Daytona Beach, about 50 miles north of the Kennedy Space Center. So this was a 6-minute exposure, rather long exposure. It shows the entire arc of the entire first stage of the rocket going off, and then it turns when the rocket motors turn off and the second stage takes off, is that gap in the upper left. So, but I was surprised that from the beach in Daytona, I was able to capture this launch. This one went up the coast, so it was just the right direction that I wanted it to go. But yeah, it was surprisingly easy once I guessed the right direction. So a bit hard to guess exactly where it is from 40 miles away. Okay, so moving on. So types of long exposure, we've talked about a lot of different types right now, right? Clouds and waves and people and steam and gathering light, as well as different types of light trails. But let's go on to different things, which is long exposures that intentionally move the camera. Surprisingly, it's called intentional camera movement, or abbreviated sometimes to ICM. So we'll talk about each one of these real quickly. Still doing pretty good on time. So with instead of moving the subject within the frame, it's also possible to move the camera with a longer exposure. This again is called intentional camera movement, or ICM, some people say. So here's a normal shot. This is actually the paint booth that the Chicago Transit Authority uses to paint some of their rail cars, the Skokie repair shops. I thought it would make an interesting subject for ICM. So this is kind of the standard shot looking down the length of the booth. Imagine this is long enough for an 80-foot rail car. So lower left frame, the camera is actually rotated during exposure. So you hold the zoom ring, and during 1/10 of a second, or whatever length of exposure you want, 1/4 of a second, you actually rotate the camera while holding the zoom ring. So it creates this sort of spiral or zoom effect. This makes the real dynamics, makes the image really dynamic, and causes the image to swirl. In the right frame, the camera is zoomed during the same 1/10 of a second exposure. Each one has a different feel, right? The right one feels like you're zooming down at warp speed. The left one feels like you're spinning, because the camera was actually spinning, right? So one's got more curved lines, whereas the one has more straight or angled lines. So as far as techniques, the right one of the zoom is simple. Just hold the camera steady and twist the zoom ring during exposure. Helps if you have a tripod, but you can certainly do it 1/10 of a second handheld, especially with the cameras we have nowadays. The one on the left, the camera rotation during exposure, is really challenging. It's challenging because you have to hold the zoom very stationary so that the camera rotates around a single point, right? In this case, this door at the far end. and then fire the camera or shoot the camera as you're moving the camera body around that circle. It's difficult to explain, but it takes some practice. Just basically hold that zoom ring, rotate the body, and press the shutter at the same time. It's really counterintuitive because you're always taught to hold the camera steady as possible. But in this one, you're actually trying to do the opposite. You're trying to rotate the camera during exposure. But it creates really good effects, right? So this is, again, camera rotation during exposure. And here you can create your own curves, right? Just by rotating it and zooming at the same time. This is a simple manhole cover in Chicago. Yeah, pretty straightforward. But the hard part, again, is just holding that camera centered around a rotation point. It's really a challenge to do, and that's the one that takes a lot of shots. So you may take 30 shots and you may get one good one, right? So don't be too dismayed if you don't get every shot along the way. Picture on the right is I zoomed at an open elevator in Chicago, making it kind of look like a portal to another dimension, right? So the elevator came up, the doors opened, the lights came on, and then I zoomed in as the doors opened up to do the exposure. So yeah, kind of just fun things you can do with it. The two different methods, camera rotation during exposure, zoom, really work really well for things that have high contrast or high brightness differences. These happen to be Christmas lights on a little walking tour that we had. You don't really see it much in the dark trees, but you really see the Christmas lights really well. The swirl on the left side and then the zoom on the right side. Excuse me. So now that we've seen a few examples of long exposure, the tough part begins. Planning for long exposure. So here are some of the questions you need to think about, and I think we've touched on most of them when you're planning for a long exposure. So what motion do you want to blur, right? And this picture on the right, it's some carnival rides that I was blurring. What does the blur add to your photo, right? In this one, it just adds that feeling of motion. It's a long enough exposure I can see the spokes on the wheel, but they're not completely blurred out. It's not undistinguishable what that is. And then how do you want to compose your photo, right? How do you want to use that blur or that movement as a compositional element? And then how much blur do you want, right? Like I said about this Ferris wheel, right? I want enough that you can tell that it's moving, but not so much that it blurs one spoke into the next spoke. But again, you can try different lengths of time, right? You can do different things. So that depends a little bit on how fast something is moving. We saw that with the bicycles, right? They were moving fairly fast. There was a fairly short, long exposure. How close are you to that? Again, we saw that with the bicycles, right? Something that's closer, or the locomotive. Something that's closer will blur more than something that's further away. And is the distance changing while you're shooting? So if it's moving toward you, it's a little tougher to get that blurred feeling. And again, if something's moving toward you like a car, you'll get more blurring on the front than the back, again, like the locomotive you saw. And what lens are you going to use, right? A wide angle lens is probably not going to see as much difference front to back as well as a telephoto lens. And then most importantly, the subject should still be recognizable as to what it is, unless you're going with something completely abstract like the previous Christmas light shots, where it's just about color and light. And then trial and error or trial and learning is your friend, right? Take a few test shots, try something. If it doesn't work, try something else, right? If it's too blurry, you try a shorter exposure. If it's not blurry enough, you try a longer exposure. Yeah, you just keep trying. I'm a big proponent to just keep trying things. You have a starting point, but there's not one formula for every one of these long exposures. You can just use guidelines to get you there, to get you started, but then adjust. Take multiple pictures so you have more to work with when you get home and more to choose from when you get it home. So keep looking at your pictures, keep trying, keep doing different things. Don't just take one picture and just call it good enough. So I won't go into the details of this, but this kind of gives you a starting point. Different time scales right here. Might be a little bit long here, 1 second up to 6 minutes. And then what that object is it a people or is it water? Or is it falling water or flowing water? Water with waves, plants, clouds. Are they slow moving clouds, fast moving clouds? What does it really depend on, right? People depend on whether they're moving or stationary. Flow depends on the speed that the water's falling, like we saw with the different water volumes, the water flow volumes. And wind speed has a lot to do with movement for clouds and waves and plants and all sorts of things. So I'll leave this here. You guys can study it later on, gives you a little idea of where to start. What equipment do you need? For most of it's nothing more than what you probably already have, right? A camera, a sturdy tripod, a remote. You can also use the release delay setting, which is my favorite way to shoot for long exposure. You can purchase ND filters if you want to take long exposures to do really long, much longer exposures. So yeah, I recommend a 3-stop and a 6-stop filter to start out if you're going to do ND filters. If you need more light blocking, you can actually stack the filters, right? So a 3 and a 6 together make 9-stop filter. So that's one way to reduce the amount of light coming into your exposure. And there's a choice between, circular or rectangular filters or variable ND filters too. I don't really like variable ND filters because they're actually just two polarizers, and sometimes they can create an X-like appearance in your images. I prefer just to have fixed 3-stop, 6-stop, 10-stop filters. Then what type of filters, right? There's circular filters and there's square filters, screw-on filters, or sometimes magnetic today. Circular filters to me seem much simpler. They're much better for circular polarizers. Magnetic mounts can be quicker, and they're getting much better than they used to be. I used to not like magnetic mounts, but I saw some over the weekend that are just much better than much more holding power, don't get knocked off as easily. So one downside of circular filters, screw-on filters, is they can be over-tightened. So try not to tighten your filter all the way, tighten it just till it's snug. And if you stack too many filters, especially with a wider angle lens, you'll start getting vignetting in the corners, right? You'll actually start seeing the filter itself in your photographs. And one strategy is to buy the largest filter you need for the largest diameter lens you have, and then get step down rings for the other lenses. So my biggest lens is an 82 millimeter, but my telephoto lens is 72 millimeter. So I just have a step down from, 78. I just have a step down ring from 82 down to 78, and I use the same filters on my telephoto that I use on all my other lenses. So that's one strategy, so you don't have to have multiple sets of filters, all different sizes. Square filters are faster to change once you get set up. They're much easier if you're going to use these graduated filters on the right-hand side. They don't have vignetting as much, unless you're really stacking a lot. Take a little longer to set up. They're bulkier and they're prone to light leaks. So if they don't seal real well all the way around this filter holder, sometimes you'll get some light leaks, especially on the really long exposure. If you're doing a 6-minute or 10-minute exposure, light leaks become somewhat of an issue because light will leak around the filter and into the sensor. And the newer thing is some of the lenses now have rear or drop-in filters. Really great for ND filters. They're really small. They're relatively cheap compared to the big glass filters. Not really easy to use a polarizing filter. It is rather thin, delicate glass, and there's no way to stack these filters. So you'd have to buy different filters for every ND that you want. And the real downside, in my opinion, is it's another set of filters to carry. It's another thing to carry in the bag. But they're out there. So step by step, doing a long exposure image. Compose the image like we talked about in the plan for long exposure slide. Take a test shot. Check the image for brightness, that you're getting what you want, that the histogram is good, and that the composition is what you want. If not, go back and adjust. Go back to step 1 or 2. Take another test shot. Just keep going, iterating through there till you get what you want. If you're using an ND filter, now is the time to put the ND filter on. You'll have to adjust the settings for long exposure based on calculations or an app. and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then if you've got a DSLR, you might want to cover the viewfinder again for really long exposures, because sometimes the viewfinder creates an optical path for light to get in through the back. Again, probably more for the longer, really long exposures, the 6 or 7, 8, 10-minute images, but it is a possibility with DSLRs. Not a problem with mirrorless because there is no light path into the sensor. So once you put that ND filter on, take another test shot and then check the image and histogram. Go back to step 8 and adjust if you have to. And then just continue until your spouse asks how long you're going to be. Right? Then just say one more, just one more, just one more. So some tips for the long exposure, things we already hit on, right? Combine waterfall images, short exposure for the vegetation, and long exposure for the water to limit the wind movement, and or long exposure for the flow of the stream itself. So the spiral of the stream, so that'll help. Circular polarizer, my shameless plug, helps reduce glare and reflections. If you're stacking magnetic filters or screw-on filters, look for vignetting in corners, especially with the wider angle lenses, 24 millimeter or less, maybe even 35, depends how thick your filters are. If a screw-on filter gets stuck, the best solution is to put your entire palm, like you're covering a glass, on the end of the filter and try to rotate it off the lens. That puts an even pressure on the filter itself. When you're trying to squeeze it from the sides, you're putting pressure on one side and forcing it tighter in through the other sides. So best to just put your entire palm on it. You'll get the filter dirty, but you'll get it off. So put your entire palm over the surface of it. And then when you put your ND filter on, don't forget to turn to bulb mode for something that's longer than 30 seconds. Although today's cameras, they're actually going longer than 30 seconds, some of the newer cameras. So this isn't as big a deal as it used to be. But something I've done frequently is you put the ND filter on, but then you forget to change your exposure. And then achieving focus, again, not as much a deal as it used to be, but best to do that focus before you put the ND filter on. But today's cameras, depending how bright it is, they almost all can focus through the ND filters nowadays. But if you've got an older camera, you may have to do that focusing before you put the ND on. Like we saw, certain types of light or lightning may cause flickering and long exposures. And then use an app to calculate shutter times for ND filters. There's different apps that are out there. There's Photo Pills, which costs, I don't know, $10, I think, $12, I think, in the App Store. There's a free one called LE Calculator. And then some of the filter companies have their own version of these apps. So these apps kind of look like this. The one on the left is the one I use most, which is Photo Pills. And basically you put in the test settings, so your settings without the filter, and then you tell it what kind of filter you're putting on it. So this one's f11, 1/10 of a second, ISO 50. And then I'm putting on a 10-stop filter with the same f-stop, same ISO. And it tells me down here what the shutter speed is, 1 minute, 42 seconds. So I can either set that with my camera, or I can time that on a watch or my phone, or there actually has a built-in timer down here too. You can just say timer, and it will start the minute and 42-second timer and blink when it's done, give you a tone when it's done. So, but there's other long exposure calculators too that are free, and just as simple. You just set the number of stops. It'll tell you the shutter time, number of stops, so base settings, and then the stops, and it'll tell you the shutter time. But they're out there. Nisi has one. V-Filters has one. So they're out there. They're easy to use. Okay, so I'm at 48 minutes. Any questions, or shall we go through some more examples?
Let's see here. Well, let's see. We do have a question, Mark.
Using the filter and the filter at the same time, or using them for different applications, and what is the difference in using graduating and
Okay, the question is, are you using the neutral density filter and the polarizing filter at the same time, or at different times for different applications? And the second part of your question was,
Graduated.
Graduated.
density filters or standard neutral density filters? Is there a reason to use a variable, or would I just stay with the standard? One.
Okay.
I couldn't quite hear that, sorry.
Okay. The question was about the standard neutral density filters versus the
Standard
versus the
neutral
graduated,
density versus the variable.
versus the variable neutral density
Oh,
filters.
variable, yep, yep. So to answer the first question, do I use both polarizer and ND? Yes, I do. And there are some companies that make polarized ND filters as well if you want to buy more filters.
Do you use them at the same time?
But I use them at the same time. And one of the questions that came up actually with the previous presentation was, do I put which order do I put them on? I put the ND filter closer to the lens and the polarizer farther out from the lens because I want to be able to rotate the polarizer. And also it's more difficult to remove a screw-on filter from the female side of the polarizer filter. So because the filter itself rotates, right? It's hard to grip that sometimes. So, and the other question was why I don't like variable ND filters.
Or if you use them.
Do you use them?
No, I don't. I don't. They sometimes have a color cast, and then at certain points they can create an X. And then I like to be able to specify what ND I want exactly. And those filters aren't exactly calibrated to know what it is. So, but it's all personal preference, right? I mean, if you feel comfortable with it and you're not having problems, yeah. Yeah, I'm going by what I read and what I've learned from other people. But your experience, your mileage may vary, right? Your experience may be different.
Gotcha. Did that, did that answer your question, Mark? And Mark?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Would it be possible to photograph? I'm thinking of a waterfall that I often photograph. But what I'd like to do, and I don't know if you've done it or not, use one shutter speed to get the proper amount of blur on the water, say 1 to 2 seconds, then leave the camera where it is, shoot the exact same scene at about a minute or two to get the clouds. Could you make those into layers and do it in Photoshop?
Yeah, you could. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever done that or
I haven't done that. Typically, I don't like to have sky in my waterfall shots because it's so bright compared to the waterfall. It's kind of hard to manage. You'd almost have to use an ND filter to get the long exposure for the sky and knock down the light to be comparable to what you get down at ground level. So it sounds like a real challenge. Generally, when I take waterfall pictures, as you saw with most of these, there's no sky in it.
right?
Personally.
And I want to do because something a little different.
Yeah.
I'll mess around with it. And the other question I had is a long shot. Have you ever done focus stacking with long exposures?
No. No,
Or not?
never have. Again, because things move, right?
Yeah, like a series of rocks in the foreground.
Yeah. I mean, rocks or flowers or whatever you have in the foreground and trying to focus stack. I don't know why you'd want to do focus stacking on something like that because you're going to try to capture long exposure. You're trying to capture movement. So what's moving that you're trying to capture?
A series of rocks in the foreground. I have a hard time getting all the rocks in focus.
Ah, okay. Yeah, you could certainly do a shorter exposure after you get the long exposure.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could do a longer exposure. Excuse me, I said that backwards. You could do a longer exposure to get the brightness of the rocks or a different exposure and blend them together just like you would a focus stacking. It'd be no different than that one of the falls, right? It'd be really no different. You're just blending two areas together at the same time, just like this one, right? And this one, I just blended the regular waterfall, this part, with this part of this image, right? So you could do that with the rocks in the foreground as well.
Well, thanks.
Wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know that I learned a ton.
Yeah.
And photographs are really, really awesome. I know that some folks in the group are using smartphones as their primary, method of taking pictures. Do you have any quick tips, probably, like, to wrap up our presentation on
Yeah.
advice for smartphone users?
Yeah, one trick with phones. I have an iPhone, so I do it with an iPhone. But if you're taking like a long exposure of a waterfall, one trick is to use something called live view, which is really just a short video, right? I'm not sure what the other phone manufacturers call it. So you do a short video or a live view of the waterfalls itself. Hold the camera very steady, so you capture the movement of that water falling down. And then when you review the image, you can actually turn on something in the live view image viewer that allows it to change that to long exposure. I'm trying to look for a picture right now that I just did, but I can't seem to find it. Oh, here it is. Yeah, up in the upper left corner, you have a choice between live view or loop view or bounce view or something called long exposure. And basically what that does is it takes that short clip of images and blends them all together to create sort of a blurred image. So
Cool.
yeah,
Great.
it's kind of a cool trick. So
Yeah, thank you very much.
yeah,
Yeah, and super informative, and yeah, your photos are beautiful, and I learned a ton.
good. Thanks. Send me an email if you have any questions. My email's there on the screen. Yeah, I'm glad to do this workshop. I've got photo workshops throughout the year. I just finished one in Savannah. Going to Palouse in June, that sort of thing. So we'll be trying some of these techniques out there, especially like
Sound-
New York Finger Lakes. Beautiful waterfalls out there in the Finger Lakes.
Yeah, awesome.
So
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and I'll definitely, yeah, get your information out to the club.
great. I'll send you the summary of some of those slides, and yeah, again, contact me if you have any questions.
Sounds great. All right, thank you. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
thanks very much. Have a good night.
You too. Thank you. Bye.